Life has a way of throwing challenges at us when we least expect them. In this story, Emily is forced to confront betrayal, family tension, and the overwhelming desire to reclaim her true home. After discovering her boyfriend's infidelity, she decides to leave her life in New York behind and return to the house her father left her. What follows is a journey of self-discovery, strength, and standing up for what is rightfully hers. This is a story of reclaiming peace and independence. Subscribe to our channel to begin today's life story. My name is Emily, and until 2 weeks ago, I thought my life was perfect. I had a steady job at Hawthorne Financial Group, a well-established company with branches across the country. I lived in a nice apartment in New York City, and everything seemed to be falling into place. My boyfriend, James, and I had been together for 3 years. We met in college, during my senior year, and things moved quickly between us after graduation. I landed my dream job as a financial analyst, and James moved in with me when I signed the lease for a bigger place. Life was good, but then, everything changed in an instant. It was Madison's birthday party, one of my closest friends from work. We were at an upscale bar in the heart of the city. A private room reserved just for her celebration. The music was lively, the drinks were flowing, and everyone was in high spirits. I was having a good time, chatting with colleagues and catching up with old friends. But then, I felt the need to step away for a moment. I excused myself and walked down the dimly lit hallway to the restroom. As I passed the coat check area, something caught my eye. There was a couple making out in the corner. I didn't mean to stare, but something about the man's profile looked strangely familiar. He turned slightly, and my heart dropped. It was James, my James, with his hands all over a blonde woman I had never seen before. They were kissing, oblivious to the world around them. My stomach twisted into knots. I stood frozen, unable to move or speak. It took a few seconds for my brain to process what my eyes were seeing. Then, the anger hit me like a tsunami. I couldn't keep it in. I had to say something. "Are you kidding me?" I shouted, my voice cutting through the music. Several people turned to look. James jumped back as if he had been electrocuted. His eyes widened in shock when he saw me. "Emily, this isn't," he started. But I cut him off. "Don't you dare say this isn't what it looks like." I spat, my voice shaking with rage. "Because it looks exactly like my boyfriend cheating on me at my best friend's birthday party." "Emily, please," he pleaded, reaching out to me. "Let's go home and talk about this." "Home?" I laughed bitterly, my voice hollow. "You mean the apartment that I pay for? The one that you live in rent-free because I was foolish enough to believe you loved me?" I turned and walked away, ignoring him calling my name. Madison, who had been inside the bar, followed me out. I could barely hold back the tears. My emotions a mix of hurt, betrayal, and anger. She helped me get into a cab. But I was too angry to cry then. The tears would come later. When I was alone in the apartment, surrounded by the remnants of a life I had built with someone who never truly cared. For the next 2 weeks, I threw myself into work. I stayed late at the office, taking on extra projects to keep my mind busy. But every time I returned to the apartment, the emptiness hit me, not because I missed James. No. The anger was still too fresh for that, but because I realized something. I had no real ties to New York. The job, yes, but the city itself? It no longer felt like home. I missed the peace of Greenfield, the small town in Pennsylvania where I had grown up. The house that my father had built with his own 2 hands stood waiting for me. It was my true home, the one he had left me when he passed away from cancer 8 years ago. I was 19, in my sophomore year of college, when I got the call at 3 a.m. that he was nearing the end. By the time I made the 6-hour drive home, he was already gone. I remember the drive, the raw, aching sadness that had settled deep within me. It was in that house where I had spent so many childhood years, where my father had made sure I would always have a place to return to. But when he died, I went back to college and tried to focus on my studies. My mother stayed in the house, alone, for about a year before she dropped a bombshell on me. She was getting remarried to Mark, a man who had 2 teenage children from a previous marriage. I wasn't happy about it. It felt too soon after my dad's death. And the idea of strangers living in our family home made my skin crawl. But my mom pleaded with me, saying she was lonely and that Mark was a good man who made her happy. In the end, I agreed, even though it felt like the house was no longer mine. After graduation, I took a job in New York, hoping to escape the tension and discomfort I felt when I visited home. The house had changed. My mom's new family dynamic had made me feel like an outsider. I loved my mom, but the house felt strange with Mark and his kids, Sarah and Jason, in it. I had no place there anymore. As I sat alone in my half-empty apartment in New York, scrolling through my phone and ignoring James's texts, I made a decision. It was time to go back. To go home. My father's house was waiting for me. And it was time to reclaim it. I could transfer to the company's branch in Pittsburgh, just a short drive from Greenfield, and finally put the pieces of my life back together. I was done with New York. It was time to start fresh. The decision to move back was not an easy one, but it felt necessary. I knew it was time to let go of the life I had built in New York. That apartment, those memories with James, they all felt like a distant chapter in a book I was ready to close. My father's house in Greenfield, the place where I had grown up, was calling me. It was the one true home I had left. My job at Hawthorne Financial Group had a branch in Pittsburgh, which was only a 30-minute drive from Greenfield. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to start fresh. And I knew I could transfer there without hesitation. I called my boss, Mike, the next morning to request a transfer. April, what's on your mind? He asked. His voice friendly but curious. I told him straight away that I wanted to move to Pittsburgh and transfer to the branch there. He seemed hesitant at first. But after a few days of discussions, he called me back with the good news. There would be a small pay cut, but the cost of living in Greenfield was significantly lower than in New York City. So it balanced out. I accepted without hesitation. That evening, I called my mom. I knew I had to tell her about my plans, even though I feared how she might react. Mom, I said when she picked up the phone, I have something to tell you. I'm moving back home, to the house. There was a long pause on the other end, and then she spoke. Your room? But Emma's been using your room since she started college. We've made some adjustments. I felt my stomach churn. Well, she'll have to move to one of the other rooms. It's my house, Mom. Her voice softened, and I could hear her trying to hide the discomfort. Of course. I wasn't expecting this, but we'll be happy to have you home. Her words didn't quite reassure me. There was something in her tone that suggested she wasn't as thrilled about my return as she let on. But I pushed the thought away, determined to move forward. Great, I said, trying to keep the conversation light. I'll be there in 2 weeks. I just wanted to give you a heads up so you can get my room ready. The next 2 weeks were a blur. I terminated my lease, sold most of the furniture in my apartment, and packed up everything that mattered: clothes, books, photos, the remnants of a life I was leaving behind. My friends threw me a goodbye party at our favorite bar, though I made sure it wasn't the one where I'd caught James cheating. I needed closure, but I also needed to leave New York behind without looking back. The drive to Greenfield took nearly 6 hours. The landscape was familiar yet foreign, and the closer I got to my childhood home, the more anxious I became. What would it be like? Living there again after all these years? Would it feel like home? Or would I simply be an outsider, returning to a place that no longer felt mine? When I finally pulled up to the house, my heart ached with both nostalgia and unease. The 2-story colonial home on Maple Street looked just as it had when I left, though the blue paint had faded a bit, and the flower beds that Mom had always kept so meticulously tended were now overgrown. It wasn't the same. It couldn't be. Before I could even grab my bags from the car, the front door opened. Mom stepped out, looking older than when I had last seen her at Christmas. There were new lines around her eyes, and her brown hair had streaks of gray. April, she said, walking toward me with open arms. Welcome home. I hugged her. breathing in the familiar scent of her vanilla perfume. But as we stood there, I couldn't help but feel the distance between us. The warmth wasn't the same. It wasn't the same as when Dad was still alive. "Hi, Mom," I said softly, but as I looked past her, I saw Mark standing in the doorway. He was tall, with thinning hair and a permanent frown. I had never disliked him, but I could never warm to him either. "April," he nodded stiffly as I approached the house. His eyes flicked over to the car packed with boxes and suitcases. "Looks like you brought your whole life with you." "Just the essentials," I replied, forcing a smile. "Mostly clothes and work stuff." Mom led me inside, trying to act as though everything was normal. But I could feel the tension hanging in the air. The house looked different, familiar, yet strange. The furniture had been rearranged, and many of the decorations from my childhood were gone, replaced by things I didn't recognize. As we walked through the dining room, Emma and Jason appeared from upstairs. Jason, now 17 and nearly 6 feet tall, gave me a quick nod. "Hey," he said awkwardly. "Hey, Jason, you've gotten tall," I said with a smile, trying to break the ice. Emma, 19 and dressed in designer clothes, stood with her arms crossed. Her expression was cool, distant. "So, you're actually staying?" she said, not bothering to mask her displeasure. "Emma," Mom warned, but Emma just rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath. I forced a smile. "It's good to see you too, Emma." Dinner that night was awkward, to say the least. Mark talked about his job at the local bank. Jason mumbled one-word responses when spoken to, and Emma picked at her food while glaring at me every now and then. I could tell that things were not going to be easy, but I had made my decision. I was home now, and I wasn't going anywhere. This house was mine, and I would reclaim it, no matter what. It didn't take long for the reality of living back in Greenfield to settle in. The house that had once been my sanctuary now felt foreign and uncomfortable. Every corner seemed to carry the weight of years gone by, the absence of my father hanging heavily in the air. My mother was still here, of course, but it was clear that things were different. The house no longer felt like it was mine, and my mother's new family, Mark, Emma, and Jason, only made that reality more apparent. The tension that simmered beneath the surface made every day feel like a quiet battle. Emma, especially, made no attempt to mask her resentment. She was angry about the room she had taken over and made sure I knew it. And Mark, despite his calm exterior, seemed to think he had some claim to this house simply because he'd lived here for the past several years. It became clear very quickly that my return wasn't as welcomed as my mother had led me to believe. She would tell me everything would be fine, that we could make it work. But her actions spoke differently. I spent most of my time either at work or holed up in my room, trying to avoid the tension that filled every corner of the house. But no matter how hard I tried to avoid confrontation, it always found its way to me. One evening, as I was getting ready to sit down for a quiet dinner, I found myself confronted by an unexpected discussion. Mark and my mother were sitting at the dining table with a pile of bills in front of them. The air was thick with anticipation as I walked in. My mother's eyes were wide, her expression carefully neutral. "Emily," she said, her voice oddly formal, "we need to talk." I could already feel my heart pounding. Something was off, and I braced myself for what was coming. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice cautious. Mark cleared his throat, his tone blunt. "Since you moved back, our expenses have increased significantly: water, electricity, heating. We need to discuss how we're going to handle it." I froze. The last thing I had expected was a conversation about money. I had always paid my share of the groceries, sending my mother $300 every month, as we had agreed when I first moved back. But now, they were suggesting something else. "You're already contributing to the grocery fund, Emily," my mother added, looking uncomfortable. "But we think it would be fair if you paid rent, $1 a month." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Are you serious?" I asked, my voice rising in disbelief. "This is my house, Mom. My father left it to me. I shouldn't be paying rent." Mark leaned forward, his expression cold. You can contribute, or you can leave, but if you're living here, you're paying your share. The words hit me like a slap. I had always believed that, despite our differences, this house would always be mine. And now they were asking me to pay rent for a place I had inherited from my father. For a place I was trying to reclaim as my own. I turned to my mother, expecting her to back me up, to say something, anything, that would make me feel like I wasn't crazy for thinking this was wrong. But she didn't. She just sat there, looking away, silent. She wasn't on my side. Tears threatened to spill, but I swallowed them down. This wasn't the time. I couldn't let them see my hurt. I looked at Mark and then at my mother. And I knew that if I didn't do something now, I would lose everything I had worked so hard to reclaim. I won't pay rent, I said, my voice steady but firm. This is my house. I'll charge rent to all of you, $500 a month. That's $2 total, and it's fair considering the market rate around here. The silence that followed was deafening. Mark's jaw clenched, and my mother's face went pale. Emma, who had been lurking in the background, was the first to speak. You can't charge us rent, she shrieked. You're insane. I met her gaze, unwavering. If you don't like it, you're welcome to find another place to live. But I'm not backing down. For a long moment, no one said anything. Finally, Mark stood up, his face hard. You're throwing your own family out for money? He demanded, towering over me. I'm not throwing anyone out, I replied, my voice calm despite the storm inside me. But this is my house. And if you want to stay here, you'll pay your fair share. That's the arrangement. I grabbed my bag and walked out of the room, leaving them to think it over. The drive to work the next morning was a blur, my mind racing with everything that had just transpired. Part of me couldn't believe what I had just done. But another part of me, the part that had been pushed too far, knew it was long overdue. That evening, the silence at home was suffocating. The tension between us all was palpable. And though I tried to stay out of the way, I could feel the walls closing in. But I wasn't going to back down. I had reclaimed my space. And no one was going to take that from me. The next few days passed in eerie silence. We all went about our routines. But there was an unspoken distance between us. I kept to myself, going to work and avoiding unnecessary interactions at home. I didn't want to fight anymore. I just wanted to be left alone to process what had happened. But I knew that things couldn't go on like this. They had to make a choice, either accept my terms or leave. The house was mine, and I was going to make sure it stayed that way. Weeks passed, and the house became quieter, emptier. I continued with my routine, work during the day, keeping to myself at home, and avoiding the constant tension. The decision I had made had stirred something in me, a strength I had forgotten existed. For the first time in years, I felt in control of my life again. I wasn't just reclaiming my father's house, I was reclaiming my sense of self. Then, one Sunday afternoon, Mark and my mother cornered me in the living room. We've made a decision, Mark said, his voice stiff. We're moving out, my mother added quietly, her eyes downcast. The words hit me in ways I hadn't expected. Relief washed over me first, followed by sadness. I had fought for my independence. But I never imagined it would lead to this, the breaking point in my relationship with my mother. She had chosen Mark, and in many ways, that had become the final wedge between us. Okay, I said, my voice calm. Take what you need. The moving process was tense, filled with slammed doors and unsaid words. As they packed their things, I stood in the doorway, watching the life I had once shared with my family slip away. It hurt more than I expected, but it was necessary. When the last of their things were gone, the house felt quieter still. But for the first time in a long while, I felt peace settle over me. It was my home now. Really mine. I could start over, rebuild, and fill it with the things that truly mattered to me. As I sat on the couch, my best friend Megan came over to see the changes. Do you regret it? She asked. No, I replied. I miss my mom, but I don't regret standing up for myself. This is my home now, and I'm finally at peace with it. To follow more stories like this, make sure to subscribe to our channel for new life stories.